Okay, so I think we can get started. So hi everyone, welcome to the 6th webinar in our 9-part Reducing Scope 3 Emissions series. Today we're going to be looking at emissions arising from leased assets covered by categories 8 and 13, Greenhouse Gas Protocol's Scope 3 standard. Just want to take this opportunity to thank our partners for the series, PA Consulting, Owen Mumford and Shoesmiths. And also before we start, just to go through a little bit of housekeeping. So firstly, the event is being recorded. So don't worry about making too many notes. We'll share the recording with you after the event's finished. We're also activating automatic captions. So just a quick caveat on them. You can activate them in the tools bar, but please do forgive any errors or typos that might occur because they are automatically generated. Finally, we've scheduled a lot of time for Q&A at the end of the session. So as we go through the presentations of our speakers, please feel free to post any questions that you have for them in the chat, in the Q&A box. Anything else, please post in the chat. So questions in the Q&A box and anything else in the chat, and that just helps with the moderation of the Q&A at the end of the session. If you do post your questions in the chat, they'll probably not be answered, so make sure they are in the Q&A. And also you can upvote any questions that you like the look of and would like answered that have been posted in there. Okay, so I'll end the poll and I'll actually share the results of them. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, but hopefully for the people that aren't measuring and reporting the Scope 3 leased assets emissions, hopefully we'll be able to help you, give you some tips today on how you can do that. And for the people that are already looking at the leased asset Scope 3 emissions, maybe we can add to what you already know, and you can sort of know that you're doing it right, hopefully as well. Okay, so with that, I'm really happy to hand over to Steve Kenzie, who's the Executive Director of the UN Global Compact Network UK. So Steve, over to you.
Thanks very much, Patrick, and welcome everyone. Really appreciate you being with us today. Let's just a bit more housekeeping. Let's go on to the next slide. We've got a lot of horrible news in the on the airwaves this week. It's really really quite sad to see the events in the US, the embarrassing distraction of Partygate here in the UK. But I think it's really critical that we not forget the crisis in the Ukraine at the moment that just keeps getting worse. There are now over 6.5 million Ukrainian refugees that have fled across the borders, seeking safety in neighboring countries. Another 8 million people displaced internally. They need help. In response, the UN High Commission for Refugees, the UN Refugee Agency, has stepped up its operations and capacity across the Ukraine, as well as in neighboring countries, but they need support, and you can help by making a donation, or even better, by donating goods or logistical support. The UN Global Compact, the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and the Connecting Business Initiative have created a business guide to the Ukraine humanitarian crisis with information about how your business can help in this horrible situation. We've put some links in the chat. Do please consider if there's anything that you can do, please do it. Now let's move on to the next slide. And before we get stuck into the programming, I do want to tell you just a little bit about the UN Global Compact. We are the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative with over 16,000 companies participating globally, another 3,800 non-business organizations that have made the commitment to our 10 principles of corporate sustainability. These principles are derived from UN treaties in the areas of human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption, which makes them truly universal and a very strong foundation for our initiative. If your organization isn't already in the Global Compact, we'd be very happy to speak with you about how to join. It's quite straightforward. Your CEO needs to make 3 commitments. First, to operationalize the Global Compact principles throughout your organization. Second, to report annually on the progress towards doing so. And finally, to support the wider UN development agenda, which at the moment is best represented by the UN Sustainable Development Goals. At the UK network, our mission is to support companies that have made these commitments. We seek to raise ambition for corporate sustainability and to enable practical action. We have three main work streams: business and human rights, climate action, and global goals. And we deliver more than 100 events a year to support our members and, of course, the wider business community here in the UK and abroad. We'll tell you about some of our upcoming events at the end of today's session. My colleagues have put some links into the chat that can lead you to more information about our initiative and how we can help you to achieve your sustainability aims. But now let's get on with the main program. I'm delighted to introduce our speakers. We're going to start with Olwen Smith, UK and worldwide regional lead for the Commit to Action program with CDP and the Science-Based Targets Initiative. Next, we're going to hear from Karl Desai, the Senior Advisor Advancing Net Zero at the UK Green Building Council. And lastly, we'll hear from Fernanda Amemiya, the Sustainability Director at Landsec. They'll each make brief presentations, and then we'll be able to dive into the Q&A. So as Patrick said at the beginning, please do plug your questions into the Q&A box. Please also keep an eye in there and give a thumbs up to any question that you're really keen on us to answer, and that will help us keep focused in the Q&A and make sure that we're answering the questions that are of most interest to you. Okay, now final slide from me. Let's move on to the next one. Just to set the agenda a little bit for today. The corporate value chain, also known as Scope 3, accounting and reporting standard, allows companies to assess their entire value chain emissions impact and identify where to focus reduction activities. There are 15 Scope 3 categories defined in the standard. Today, we'll be looking at two of those categories that relate to leased assets. Category 8, upstream leased assets, includes emissions from the operation of assets that are leased by the reporting company in the reporting year and not already included in the reporting company's Scope 1 or Scope 2 inventories. And category 13, downstream leased assets. These include emissions from the operation of assets that are owned by the reporting company, acting as the lessor, and leased to other entities in the reporting year that are not already included in Scope 1 or Scope 2. This category is applicable to lessors. Lessors? Anyways, I leave it to our speakers to get the pronunciation of those words correct. And so now I'm delighted to hand over to Olwen to tell us a bit more about science-based targets and Scope 3 emissions. Olwen, over to you.
Many thanks, Steve, and thank you to the UNGC UK network for having me here today. I'll be giving a quick introduction to science-based targets themselves, and then I'll be turning to look at Scope 3 target setting under the SBTi framework. So if we go on to the next slide, and I'll begin with this introduction to what science-based targets are and a bit of a background actually to the initiative that created them. So on the following slide then we'll see that the Science-Based Targets Initiative was founded as a collaborative initiative between 4 founding partner organizations, which are CDP, the United Nations Global Compact, the World Resources Institute, and WWF. And the initiative was set up in 2015, just before the Paris Agreement. And the objective was to create a framework that would enable companies to set emissions reductions targets that are in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement. So in line with what climate science tells us is necessary for that company's fair share of reducing emissions. The goal and the vision of the Science-Based Targets Initiative is to make this kind of science-based target setting become standard business practice. And we're really delighted to say that we're moving in this direction. The numbers on the right-hand side of the slide here depict that there are now over 3,000 companies setting targets through the initiative. Of those, 1,400, just over 1,400, have already had targets approved, and the others have made a commitment. And this 3,000 number represents over 1/3 of the global economy, so over 38 trillion in market capitalization. So it's really some of the biggest and highest emitting companies globally that are setting these targets. So on the next slide, I'll just briefly explain what a science-based target is. Putting it quite simply, a science-based target shows a company how much and how fast they need to reduce their emissions to be in line with the Paris Agreement. So particularly keeping warming to within 1.5 degrees and avoiding the most catastrophic impacts of climate change. The slide here shows that there are two types of science-based target. The first is a near-term science-based target. It used to be previously called just a science-based target. We've now qualified this with near-term because of the existence of a second type of long-term target. And these are 5 to 10-year targets. The short-term nature of them helps to give this manageable time span so that companies can use those near-term targets as a good way of driving accountability, of informing their investment decisions. But all of this is on the journey, and they're stepping stones really on the journey to the second type of target, which is a net zero target. These are a newer type of target from the initiative, just been launched late last year, and they serve as a North Star. And I think we know that all companies will need to be achieving net zero by 2050. Finally, just a third point on this slide, that we need companies to be disclosing their emissions on an annual basis when they're setting any kind of science-based target. And that's to allow for progress tracking against the target and for increased transparency for stakeholders. So on to the next slide, and now I'm going to be turning into to look at Scope 3 specifically, so we can advance again, and I'll just give a bit of background really to the concept of Scope 3 when it comes to target setting. And in the near term, under the Science-Based Targets Initiative framework, there is an acknowledgement that there can be some challenges when it comes to Scope 3 calculations due to data availability, and companies do have less direct influence usually over their value chain. And so with this in mind, there are slightly different requirements for Scope 3 target setting when you compare them to Scope 1 and 2. So firstly, a company needs to check if their Scope 3 emissions constitute more than 40% of their total corporate footprint. If they do, and most companies' Scope 3 emissions do surpass that 40% threshold, then a Scope 3 target will need to be set. However, the boundary of that Scope 3 target doesn't need to be as comprehensive in the short term, so it just needs to cover 2/3 of Scope 3 emissions, meaning companies can exclude up to 1/3 of their Scope 3 emissions from their near-term science-based target. And then the level of ambition, so companies' Scope 3 targets have to be aligned with a well below 2-degree trajectory, which differs from Scope 1 and 2 targets that need to be 1.5-degree aligned. And then the final point of distinction is that there are a wider variety of target setting methods available for Scope 3. So the next 2 slides, if we can advance to those, and I won't go into these in detail because there's a lot of information here, but it's really just to let you know that there are these wider range of target setting methods available for Scope 3: absolute reduction, intensity, economic intensity, physical intensity. And on the next slide then, actually a completely different type of target, which is an engagement target. This is whereby a company will be committing to have a certain percentage of their suppliers or customers by spend or emissions to have set their own science-based targets. It's more commonly used as a supplier engagement target, as purchasing organizations can have that kind of leverage in their supply chain. We'll move on to the next slide, and this is again quite detailed, so I won't go through every element of it, but it's just to focus in on the Scope 3 component in the first column, I think, in that boundary piece. So to highlight that the boundary of the Scope 3 target in the near term, as I mentioned, only needs to be 2/3, so 1/3 can be excluded. However, in the long term, as you'll see, that boundary increases to 90%. So we're asking companies that by the time they're reaching that long-term net zero target, they're going to have to be encompassing almost all of their Scope 3 emissions in their targets. So now I'm going to go on to the next slide and actually turn to these specific Scope 3 categories, and Steve has already briefly described what is included within leased assets, both upstream and downstream, but I'm going to run through them again here. And I think that the key distinction being that for upstream leased assets, these are emissions from assets that are being reported by the leasee. So it's generally the scope 1 and 2 emissions coming from the assets, generally buildings and vehicles, I think more commonly buildings. As you'll see, the minimum boundary is that scope 1 and 2 emissions of these assets during the lease time frame. So again, if a company, for example, had a lease that was only running for part of the reporting year, they would just need to take the emissions on a pro rata basis for that section of the year. And then downstream, this is where emissions are accounted for that are when the leaseor is accounting for emissions from assets that they are leasing out in the reporting year. And I'm going to go on to the next slide because I think this visualization actually kind of helps to explain it rather than words. So as I've just pointed out, category 8 upstream is when the reporting company is the leasee, and category 13 downstream is when the reporting company is the leaseor. So upstream leased assets are leased from someone, downstream leased assets are leased to someone. However, I do also want to point out that how a company accounts for emissions from leased assets does depend on 2 key things. The first is the type of lease. So if the lease is a finance lease or an operational lease. And the second is the organizational boundary approach that the company is taking in doing their GHG accounting. So whether they're using a financial control or an operational control approach. So in the interests of time, what I would recommend you doing is going to the appendix of the GHG Protocol Scope 3 Corporate Standard, and there's a dedicated 2-page appendix on the topic of accounting for leased assets, and it explains based on those different factors, so whether the lease is a finance capital lease or an operational lease, and the type of organizational boundary taken in the calculation of emissions. There's a kind of matrix table there that can help you figure out for your own situation which scopes these need to be accounted for. So on to the next slide, and I'll wrap things up here, which is just pulling out a couple of examples of near-term science-based targets that have been approved by the Science Based Targets Initiative that explicitly mention either up or downstream leased assets in them. So the first example is Landsec, and I know we're going to hear directly from Fernanda from Landsec shortly, but you can see here the scope 3 emissions from downstream leased assets included here, which if you think about it as Landsec as the leaseor, that makes sense from the previous depiction, that's the downstream category 13. Nomad Foods, on the other hand, are including upstream leased assets in an intensity target here. And then finally, we have AstraZeneca, one of the first companies to actually get their net zero target approved by the Science Based Targets Initiative, and they have both upstream and downstream leased assets included in their target. So on to the final slide, and this is just to really signpost you all to the fact that there are multiple resources available on the SBTi website to help you with target setting across all scopes, but particularly the tricky part of scope 3 target setting. And I'd again really encourage you to read the GHG protocol on scope 3 very carefully, because this is where you're going to get a lot of guidance. So that's all from me. We can, I think, hand back to Steve.
Thanks, Olwen. That's great. And a reminder that we will be sharing a recording and key takeaways. So we will be sharing these links to everyone, but also Alexandra has plugged some of the links into the chat already. So if you wanted to skip over to the GHG protocols standard and look at that appendix, the link is there for you. Thanks also for everyone that's plugging questions in already. Appreciate that. And let's keep that coming and keep the votes coming in for those. Okay, but now let's carry on with our presentations, and I'm very happy to hand over to Karl.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks to the UNGC for inviting me along to speak. My name is Karl Desai. I'm a senior advisor in the Advancing Net Zero team at the UK Green Building Council. And I'll be taking a bit more of a focused view on this category 13 that Olwen's already introduced, and linking to a guide that we produced a couple of years ago to try and demystify even further how to calculate emissions from leased assets. So if we flick forward, a quick word on the UK Green Building Council. Our mission is to radically improve the sustainability of the built environment, and that's across the entire life cycle, covering both buildings and infrastructure. If we click forward, we do this by working with our business members, of which we have over 650, to advocate to government for more progressive policy on the built environment. We have 5 key topic areas, which you can see on the outside of that circle there. And today we'll be focusing on climate change, but we do take a holistic view when it comes to sustainability for the built environment. If we flick forward. So we've already heard about the Greenhouse Gas Protocol being kind of the source of information for calculating Scope 3 emissions. And Olwen really helpfully pulled up that graphic, which sets out the 15 categories. However, when we polled our built environment members, which includes building owners, investors, property managers, developers, and a host of other stakeholders across the built environment, we found that it was actually quite challenging to report their Scope 3 emissions based off the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. Essentially, it was quite hard to make some certain interpretations for the real estate sector, which led to confusion, lack of awareness, and lack of engagement on Scope 3 emissions. So if we click forward, what we did is we worked with our membership along with technical experts to develop a guide specifically for commercial real estate organizations, so specifically for building owners and investors and building developers, to effectively interpret the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and understand how that applies to those companies. So that guide is freely available. It's about a 30-page guide, which you're welcome to download and access, and we'll include a link in the chat box to it. If we flick forward, I'm just going to now take you through some of the key concepts that we've outlined in the guide. And again, feel free to digest this in your own time. But effectively, what we set out in this guide is there are key benefits to undertaking Scope 3 reporting. And if I just work through these 6, firstly, it's quite apparent that Scope 3 emissions for commercial real estate companies make up about 85% of their total footprint. So in order to kind of demonstrate that you're taking account of your full climate footprint, you need to assess and mitigate your Scope 3 emissions. Managing climate risk is critical to have a credible net zero target. Addressing Scope 3 emissions is a vital piece of the puzzle. Demonstrating climate actions, so whether you're reporting to TCFD or have a science-based target that Olwen's already mentioned, it's important to take meaningful steps to address your Scope 3 emissions. Skipping through the next couple, so reducing operational expenses, essentially identifying where your Scope 3 emissions hotspots are can actually unlock opportunities to find efficiencies, both with your supply chain upstream and with your customers downstream. And that final one there, improving engagement with tenants, essentially for owners and investors and property managers, if they can understand what their tenant emissions are and try to ascertain data from them, it can actually help improve and strengthen relationships with customers. So if we flick forward, this slide drives home the point that actually undertaking that assessment of your Scope 3 emissions reporting can have benefits for other reporting mechanisms, including GRESB, CDP, TCFD, and of course, science-based targets. Effectively, if companies are already reporting to the ones on the right-hand side of screen, that can help inform the Scope 3 reporting process and vice versa. So it's important to first understand what existing data you're already collecting in order to inform that wider Scope 3 footprint calculation. If we flick forward, this slide drives home the point that it's important to undertake a screening exercise. So essentially taking a wide view of all your Scope 3 emissions categories before drilling down into the specific categories that are the most relevant to your organization. So this can depend on kind of the 5 criteria that are set on the right-hand side of screen. An example of one of the criteria which might trigger a deeper analysis could be a stakeholder that might have set a net zero target that's a tenant in a leased asset. That's a trigger for actually understanding what their tenant emissions are, to understand how to calculate them and how to mitigate them. So that's just an example of the relevance criteria. If we flick forward, drilling into that category 13, what we have outlined in this commercial real estate guide is that category 13 is going to be the most intensive category for property owners, operators, and managers. So it's important to focus efforts on that category. But also it's quite difficult to gain data from tenants in leased assets. So looking at the iPut Scope 3 emissions. So iPut is a large Irish-based property owner and manager. And we can see from that pie chart that over 80% of their tenant emissions have actually been, over 80% of their total footprint is tenant emissions, and that's been modeled without data collection. And the Scope 3 emissions that's been modeled with actual tenant data is about 3%. So it's a very small proportion. So if we flick forward to the next slide, what we've set out is a hierarchy of measures to estimate tenant data before actually gathering actual tenant data. So starting from the bottom of screen, there's opportunities to use model design data for new buildings and applying kind of uplifts to understand what that might be on present day values. There's the opportunity to use industry benchmarks, for example, energy use per floor area intensity, and extrapolate that out. Moving up the hierarchy, opportunity to use kind of historic tenant data, and again, extrapolate that out using key variables to try and improve the data quality. And flicking all the way to the top of the table, the best way of actually gathering this data and ensuring that you're progressing in line with the reduction targets is to use actual tenant energy use data. So that will require more concerted effort in engaging with tenants, having the energy metering in place, etc. If we flick forward to the final slide, I'd like to drive home this point that the Scope 3 inventory and data collection process is not an exact science. It's going to be a case of using some level of estimation when it comes to leased assets and tenants. But undertaking that analysis and screening process upfront is going to allow you to focus your efforts on where to focus efforts on the actual data collection piece. Once you've developed that Scope 3 inventory, it's critical to use that to drive action to reduce value chain emissions, and that's an iterative process. So on an annual basis, you'd hope that your data quality would improve, and that would also help drive down your value chain emissions. I think that's my final slide. If we just flick forward, and yeah, there's a link to the guide there, and look forward to your questions and the panel discussion. Back to you, Steve.
Thank you, Karl. That was great. And lots of great questions coming in. So let's keep that going. Let's move right on to Fernanda without any further ado. Fernanda.
Thank you, Steve. Good morning, everyone. Fernanda Amemiya, I'm Sustainability Director for Landsec. Great to be here today and discuss more about how we are reporting and trying to reduce our Scope 3 emissions, more particularly downstream leased assets. So next, please. But I think before I start, I think one thing that is important to explain is what Landsec does. I think it was already mentioned by both Olwen and Karl, and why that's important to understand the reason why downstream leased assets is so material for us. So Landsec is a FTSE 100 real estate company. We develop and manage a portfolio of 12 billion pounds across 24 million square feet. And our portfolio is mostly comprised by office buildings in central London, retail assets such as shopping centers and outlets across the UK. And we have a growing development pipeline of residential-led mixed-use urban neighborhoods. So I think from that kind of snapshot, it's clear to kind of understand why downstream leased assets is an important scope 3 category for us, right? And as a business, we have a purpose that is based on 3 key principles: sustainable place, connecting communities, and realizing potential. Next, please. And to make sure that we are delivering on our purpose and we are also embedding sustainability throughout the business, we have recently launched our new sustainability framework labeled as Build Well, Live Well, Act Well. And we set a number of targets, but one thing that is important to highlight is that it's not we created new targets from scratch, from the zero. It's actually an evolution and how we continue progressing what we believe is a long-standing leading approach to sustainability and climate change in general. So next, please. So as many other companies, we've been addressing climate change for a number of years, and we always try to take a leadership approach. So in 2016, we were the first commercial real estate company in the world to set a science-based target. At that time, aligned with a 2-degree scenario. We achieved that target in 2019, thanks to kind of a series of energy efficiency, but also because the UK grid has significantly decarbonized, helping us to achieve the target 11 years ahead of our 2030 target date. So then in 2019, we took that opportunity to increase the ambition level of our science-based target in line with a 1.5-degree scenario. And this is now the foundation of our transition to net zero. So our updated science-based target is to reduce our emissions by 7% by 2030 compared with the 13-14 baseline. And of course, it includes scope 1 and 2, but it also includes part of our scope 3 emissions associated with downstream leased assets. And to make sure that, and to help us to achieve the science-based target, last year we approved a 135 million net zero investment transition plan to help us to achieve our science-based target. And that fund is going to help us to finance a series of initiatives across our portfolio that include optimizing our building management system, trialing AI technology, for instance, replacing end-of-life gas-fired boilers with air source heat pumps instead of replacing those boilers with a like-for-like boiler. Third, increasing the on-site renewable generation by installing solar PVs across our shopping centers. And finally, to develop a customer engagement program to help our customers to identify opportunities to reduce energy and carbon within their space. So that's quite important for us to make sure that we are meeting our science-based target. And perhaps you might be thinking, but why do we need to actually include downstream leased assets in our target? Why are we investing to help tenants, occupiers to reduce their emissions? Next, please. As already mentioned, again, when we are not different from other companies, when we look at our total carbon footprint, actually scope 1 and 2 is a very small proportion of our overall carbon footprint. And looking at kind of this breakdown, you can see that scope 3 is the majority, undoubtedly. And since 2016-17, we've been assessing and reporting on our scope 3 emissions. Of course, year on year, our emissions, they change, kind of figures, they fluctuate, but the magnitude of scope 3 emissions remain always between 85 and 90% of our total carbon footprint. And as you can see in this chart here, the emissions from our customers or downstream leased assets, they represent nearly half of our total carbon footprint. So that's why it's so important for us. And as Karl mentioned, in the beginning, when we started reporting our scope 3 emissions, the proportion of estimated emissions or emissions that need to be modeled using benchmarks, proxies. They were very significant. But over the years, what we try to do is to improve the amount of data that the amount of reporting data that is based on actual figures, actual energy, actual emissions. So we've been engaging with our customers to share more data, and now nearly 60% of our emissions from downstream leased assets, they are based on actual data. And we hope we continue to improve the proportion of actual data. But our engagement activity doesn't stop on data sharing and reporting. Next, please. As I mentioned before, as part of 135 million, we are looking to engage more with our customers and to make sure that customer engagement is efficient and effective. We try to develop an overarching approach based on 3 key objectives that we are trying to achieve with different customers. And that's going to help us to reduce our emissions and collaborate more and more with our occupiers. So the first one is about raising awareness. So we need customers to understand how energy is used in our buildings, how carbon emissions are generated. So we organize customer events to discuss carbon emissions, to discuss energy. And we also invite some occupiers to come and share good practice. We also attend some building meetings. So every building has their kind of quarterly general meetings where facility management, operational team meet customers, meet occupiers to discuss building performance. Now the sustainability team is attending some of those meetings to discuss energy and carbon performance, but also to discuss projects that we are planning to implement so we can engage customers early on. And we have also joined the Cube competition with 3 of our largest buildings. And Cube competition is quite interesting because it's actually, it's literally a competition between buildings on energy efficiency performance. So it brings together landlords and occupiers to deliver energy savings. So we think that's quite an interesting way because through gamification, we think we can further raise awareness on energy savings. But we also understand that we have a wide variety of customers in our buildings, and each one of them, they are in different stage of their journey on their transition to net zero. So that's why the second pillar is about meeting customer needs, customer requirements. So what we do, because of these different needs that customers have, we organize one-to-one meetings with them, which each one of them to discuss their sustainability approach, their kind of what they are already doing, what they already know. We also present what we are doing in one particular building, and we try to identify areas for collaboration. We have already engaged last year with 8 of our off-sea customers on their sustainability plans. And we have already started finding opportunities for collaboration, not only around energy and carbon, but also around kind of social programs and so on. And the third pillar, I think it's one that's going to be very highly effective in helping us reduce carbon emissions, is about collaborating with customers. So we have set up a customer engagement program specifically on energy efficiency. So we are offering our key customers, usually the ones that occupy large space and therefore helping them to reduce emissions has a significant impact in the overall building, energy and carbon. So we are offering these customers in-depth energy assessments to help them to find opportunities in their space. So we partner with a technical consultants and we offer these customers free of charge in-depth energy assessment, and the program for each customer lasts around 2 months. And we start first with a kickoff meeting to explain the program, what they expect from the program and explain how that's going to work. We then issue a survey to their employees to gauge information about the level of awareness and interest about energy. And in the meantime, we look at their data and try to identify trends. We try to identify some spikes in the data, kind of things that potentially we can already find efficiency just by looking at the data. We then host a workshop with the company to present the findings both from the survey and the data analysis. And we then discuss potential opportunities, followed by an interview with key stakeholders of the company to identify a little bit more how the company operates. And then we undertake a site survey to validate what we found in the data analysis, and also to identify further technical improvements that can be made within their spaces. With all that information, we issue a report to the customer with a list of recommendations that contain no cost or very low cost energy interventions that they can do in their space to help them to save energy. And we also create a suggested priority list so they can work through the recommendations. So on average, we are finding 20, even 30% savings that can be kind of easily implemented with very low cost interventions. So we are now engaged with 25 customers. They represent 23% in floor area and 42% in tenant energy consumption across the portfolio. So we believe that by engaging with our customers, we are not only reducing our emissions from the downstream leased assets category, but we are also supporting them on their own transition to net zero. And as a landlord, we are providing value that goes beyond just providing the space they occupy. So we see that as a win-win approach for us and our occupiers. I think that was my last slide. Thank you. I think now back to you, Steve, and looking forward to the discussion now.
Thank you, Fernanda. That's really, really great presentation. I think this particular category of Scope 3, I think is really interesting in just how, in many ways, it demonstrates the importance of Scope 3 in driving change, because in so many cases the actions of a landlord create the conditions which almost define the Scope 1 and 2 emissions of their tenants. And having that necessary, I think, commitment from landlords to reducing their Scope 3 creates a really positive synergy that can bring about the change that we need. So I think that came through for me really, really clearly. So let's stop sharing the slides and let's get stuck into some of these great questions that we have. Now, the one with the most votes from Julia, what do you think is the best approach to account for emissions for rented co-working spaces? And Karl has put in a follow-up, but we don't really have the means of getting that clarity. But actually, I think this would be really interesting to answer from both perspectives. So shall we take that on? Maybe I could go to you first, Fernanda, just to take it from the landlord perspective. Do you have much experience with co-working spaces, or is that, are you operating at a bigger scale? Could you maybe give us some insights into that? And then if anyone is able to flip it around and take it from the tenant's perspective, that would be great also.
Yes. So yes, we have now a product offering called Mayo, which is basically a co-working space. I think that question is really based on what type of co-working space. Is just one desk? Is actually co-working space that you actually occupy a small room? So is there a possibility to have a sub-meter so we can actually measure how much that specific company is using? And I think by looking at the question, potentially, I think it's the first example is basically maybe a couple of desks. So it's difficult to have actual meter data for just a couple of desks. So what I would say is actually you need to take you need to apportion the energy consumption from, let's say, that floor or that particular area, and then you can calculate your Scope 1 and 2 for gas. That is related to your own operation. And then the building consumption ends up being your upstream leased assets. That would be my take on that question.
Thanks, Fernanda. Olwen, you were nodding. Did you want to comment?
I wouldn't have much to add. I think Fernanda answered that very well, and I guess it's just to the broader point of the kind of trade-off between primary data and some estimates or apportioning data in scope 3 more generally. And I think that was touched on in all presentations, but obviously in an ideal world, companies will have access to primary data and hopefully can set up some systems like sub-metering to ensure that in the longer run. But I think from a target setting perspective and from an action perspective, as Karl pointed out, not letting the kind of perfection be the enemy of the good, as you might say. So not needing to have a completely primary data-based accurate scope 3 inventory before you start tackling it. It's going to be iterative. It's going to be about refining it as data becomes more available and accurate over time.
Anything to add, Karl?
Yeah, just to reiterate Olwen's point, I think the intention of the process is to make decisions. So if you were to explore different co-working options, important to ask the landlord what the energy rating is of that space, so you can get a sense of whether it is the right decision for your employees to tenant it in the first place. Nothing further than that. Thanks, Steve.
Oh, I think that's a really important point, though, isn't it? The objective here isn't the measuring; it's the reducing, and we really need to keep that in mind, and not put too much of our energy into the measuring when it would be so much better directed at reducing. Okay, another question. Julia's question is very popular. A bit similar though, in terms of the shared space. So maybe you guys can tell me whether you feel there's more to add. What do you think is the best approach for leased offices where the reporting company only occupies one of the rooms/floors? What happens if the electricity consumption is billed to our company, but the emissions coming from heating are billed to the landlord with no access to actual numbers? Can we account for electricity in scope 2 and the rest of the sources in scope 3? Anybody have a comment on that? Quite dense.
I would say in an ideal scenario, that company would have access to their heating cooling data as well. But if that's not the case, if they don't know, I would say yes, that's part of scope 3, because if the landlord is assuming that the whole heating and cooling is landlord's emissions, so scope 1 and 2 emissions, then it ends up being scope 3 emissions for the company. So I think yes, that's the right approach given that condition, that situation.
Okay, thanks, Fernanda. Let's move on. The next question from Kevin. I might be able to dispense with that, but I'm happy for you guys to weigh in. But that sounds to me like a category 6 issue, that it's just upstream business travel and not really in this area. But Olwen, do you have a?
Yeah, it's actually quite a unique one. The travel to and from events, if it's employees, then it might be business travel, but that would actually be employee commuting. But there is actually in the GHG protocol, it says that transport of attendees to events or conferences or anything which aren't employees is an optional category, or it's not a category, it's an optional bucket of emissions to be accounted for. So it doesn't actually neatly fall into any one of the scope 3 categories, but it is still encouraged to report it, but it would need to be in a kind of separate other category. So yeah, not as connected directly to the leased assets topic, I think.
Okay, perfect, thank you. Now, there it is, I think a bit philosophical with this next one from Ujval. A general scope 3 question. If we use the spend-based method for calculating scope 3 emissions, considering that green products are more expensive, the more green I go within the company, as per the scope 3 calculations, I will be emitting more rather than less. What do you think about that, Olwen? I mean, I would take a child. We could argue on whether green is in fact more expensive, but let's take it as given.
Yeah, I mean yeah, exactly. I think it would depend a bit on what product you're talking about here, but it's really back to the earlier point, I think, of the difference between using estimated scope 3 data through like spend models or getting primary data. And of course, yeah, the issue with any estimates, be they through spend or other kind of emissions factors, is that it's very hard then to demonstrate a clear progress against a baseline if that's what you're always relying on. So again, I think what we would say is there's a really those types of spend estimates serve a really helpful purpose at the early stages of scope 3 calculations, right? To do that hot spotting, to understand where in your value chain your big impacts lie, and to start focusing your attention on those, and then to start trying to gather some more primary data on them so you can know that the changes you're making is having an impact. But it's really, again, the same kind of narrative we mentioned a couple of questions back about trying to use the data to hand to inform decisions, as opposed to getting too hung up on the completely accurate measuring, while always moving towards more primary and accurate data.
Yeah, I think that's it, isn't it? And if you're getting perverse outcomes from one method of calculation, then look at others to get something that just works better.
Yeah, often companies go with a hybrid calculation approach, right? Because they don't have full primary data, but they have some, and there's kind of a wide variety of approaches, but a hybrid as a kind of stepping stone towards more primary data is often used and recommended.
Great. The top question now from Sharish. Fernanda, are you writing an answer, or do you just want to say it now that that's at the top of our list?
Yes, no, I can answer very quickly then.
Let me just read it first so that for anybody that doesn't have it on their screen. The question is, for the reporting company leasing its office space as the lessee, should the energy consumption of the leased office space be calculated within scope 3 or scope 1, 2?
It should definitely be your scope 1 and 2,
yeah,
because that's going to be, let's say, if I am your landlord, it's going to be my scope 3. So if you have the data, or if you don't, you should ask the landlord for your data and then report as your scope 1 and 2.
A relatively easy one. So thank you, Sharish. Okay, from Katerina, once you identify the data for downstream leased assets, what are the main actions you can take to reduce these figures? Is it mainly changing leases as and when they come up, or with benefits for both that allow updates? And if so, what is the least change that can be made? Is there other general overview of methods to reduce these emissions as the landlord? I think a bit of interpretation perhaps required there, but because as a landlord, I mean, are you talking, I'm wondering whether we're just talking, would you ever consider getting rid of a tenant because their emissions were too high? Or would you be working with them to change the conditions to?
Yes, I don't think we would kind of turn a tenant down because we think they are using much energy. I think we usually prefer to work with them. So that's why we set up that customer engagement program, because that helped us to identify the high energy users ones and where we can find more opportunities. Perhaps, I'm not saying that in the future that's not going to happen, we never know, but right now our approach is to engage with them and help them to reduce energy.
Okay, I think we're going to move on. From Mathilde, could green leases include a clause to request tenants of buildings to provide data to the owner for GHG emission calculations? Karl, have you seen that? Is that?
Yeah, most definitely. For some more progressive tenants who want to take account for their emissions and need access to the landlord data, they can state that, yes, we require this on a monthly, annual basis, whatever it might be. But I think this really this issue's been flagged in a few of the questions in this kind of owner-occupier engagement and the data sharing piece. That's been a perennial issue in the built environment, but we need to ensure that landlords and tenants are freely sharing data so that we can all drive down both our scope 1 and 2 and our scope 3 emissions. So I think, yeah, having this understanding and building that relationship will allow things like building upgrades to take place, allow a landlord to identify how to engage with their tenants. So yes, green leases are definitely a way to allow that collaboration with landlords.
And turning it on its head, Fernanda, are you putting in clauses where tenants are sharing data with you? Is that a requirement? Is that something that can be done?
We have data sharing sometimes as part of the actual lease, sometimes as a MOU for a number of years already. So I have never found a kind of an instance where the tenant kind of declined to share data with us, or we have declined to share data with tenant. So usually the thing sometimes is just about finding the right person in the company to ask the data. I think that's and timing issues. So I think it's more an operational kind of challenge than kind of a legal challenge, let's say.
And I suppose, well, I guess the tenants are paying their bills, so they would have a pretty good sense of their consumption. So it's not like there's metering issues or where there were. I suppose that would be something further for negotiation, which kind of leans into the question from Hannah. As an occupier, she's saying we can get our staff to work more efficiently, but a lot of the sites are inefficient buildings in the first place. And so should it be the tenant upgrading or the landlord? And I suppose that's the very crux of it, isn't it? And this, since we're running out of time, I'm going to link this into the question from Eugene about double counting and basically to say it's the point of scope 3, isn't it? It's by its very definition is double counting, but it's bringing in more, giving more people an interest, so that now we have both the landlord and the tenant with a shared interest in upgrading and making that building more efficient. And then just that now it's a question of negotiating who's going to sort it out. Only a couple of minutes left, and I'm supposed to hand back to Patrick to tell about some more upcoming events. Anything that you guys didn't get to say that you were hoping you'd get to say, Karl? Did you want to have 20 seconds to get out any final messages?
I'm happy to go first. Just building on what you mentioned lastly there, Steve. Scope 3 reporting is all about identifying where to focus your efforts. So if you're a landlord, you identify a high consuming site, that's where you focus your efforts with the tenant engagement piece that Fernanda stepped through. So this is all about getting that information to take action. So that's the final message that I'd like to put out there.
Thanks, Karl. Fernanda, any final words?
No, I think for us, it's all about kind of an open conversation. We need to start talking about emissions between landlords and tenants, and the relationship can't stop when we sign the lease. That's when our relationship should start. So I think that's the approach we are taking as landlord.
That's great. Thanks, Fernanda. Olwen, anything to add?
Yeah, I think I'd really reiterate that message of collaboration. I think no matter what the scope 3 category is, but particularly for leased assets, it's really going to be about effective collaboration between customers and suppliers, tenants and landlords into the future. And there's actually probably good opportunities for innovation and knowledge sharing and capacity building, as well as the kind of more boring, let's say, data side of it. So yeah, would really just emphasize that collaborative nature of this kind of work.
Great. Thank you all so much. It's been a really interesting conversation. Appreciate you sharing so much. Thanks, audience, for your great questions. Apologies to those of you that we didn't get to. We'll try to follow up. I saw your question, Richard, that went in early. And obviously, we've been pretty focused on built environment and not so much the circumstance you've described there, but we'll try and scare up an answer to that for the key takeaways when we follow up. Patrick, over to you. I haven't given you much time, but thanks again, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Steve, and thanks to the speakers as well. Thought that was a really, really good session. Just to tell you a little bit before you head off about the upcoming events we've got here at the UN Global Compact Network UK. So next in this series, we'll be looking at sold products on the 16th of June. So we'll be joined by PA Consultant and Sky for that one. So it should be another really good session. Feel free to scan that QR code and register for that one. Additionally, in parallel to this series, we're running a Climate and Human Rights Building Resilience for Business series. Next session in that series is on the 15th of June. We'll be looking at supply chain solutions. And additionally, just finally, we've got a members only event in the climate space coming up. And that's going to be looking at nature-based solutions on the 10th of June. So if you're a member and would like to register, please feel free to do so. If you're not a member and you would like to become a member, feel free to get in contact with us on using those contact details shown on your screen. So thank you very much, everyone. Thanks again to Steve. Thanks to the speakers. Thank you, everyone, for your brilliant questions. I look forward to seeing you at the next session in the series. Have a good day.